Okay. All right, I'll get Warburton. I'm with ARCUS and the PolarTREC program. I'm currently situated in Anchorage, Alaska. Judy Fonstock with ARCUS is also co-hosting this event today. Today, we're really excited to be having this presentation with the research team that went to the Arctic almost, not quite a year ago, but we're getting there, a year ago in 2018. And we want to hear how the team has, what they've been learning over the course of summer and over this last little bit of time. So today is April 8th, 2019, and I will go to the next slide. We will be trying this new platform for us, so please be patient with us as we go through this presentation. But today, post your questions in the group chat. The only people that will have video will be the research team and Kim Young, so that we can see what they're up to and they can share their slides with us. And at the end, we'll try to address all of the questions if we don't interject along the way. This event's also being recorded and will be sent out to everybody that registered. Kim is part of the PolarTREC program. She is part of the 2018 group. We just did training for 2019, so we're moving right along here, but we're really excited to have Kim share with us what she did over the summer. And PolarTREC is where we put teachers like Kim with researchers like Christina, who Kim will introduce in a moment, out in the field, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And it gives educators a chance to learn about science hands-on with a research team and bring it back to their learning settings. If you are just joining us and I haven't already, and you missed the instructions earlier, please just type in where you're from and how many students you have joining you today. And I think that's it. I think I'll turn this over to Kim.
So, hi everyone. First of all, I say echo what everyone's saying about welcome. We're really excited to have you here. And for our student participants especially, I hope as we're going through, start putting those questions in the chat box. We definitely want to get to your questions and hear from you. So definitely start shouting out your questions to your teacher and getting them going. We definitely want to talk about stuff. So as Lee said, my name is Kim Young. I am a high school world history teacher. So I am kind of an unlikely PolarTREC participant and really approaching this study from a very different lens as a world history teacher. But I feel what I really, even more so since being in the field, that a lot of this information is really relevant in the world history classroom, and I've been excited to do a lot of interdisciplinary work. I got to spend a good portion of the summer with Christina Minions. I'll let you introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christina Minions. I am a research assistant at Woods Hole Research Center. I've been working there for about 2 years now, mainly focusing on studying the impact of climate change on Arctic boreal regions.
And not able to be with us today is Dr. Jennifer Watts, who is also a part of the team. She's flying to Massachusetts right now, so she's not able to join us, but some of her research and work will be recognized during the webinar as well. So first of all, to talk to you guys a little bit about where we went. Christina and I traveled all over Alaska. I really got to engage with all of Alaska, it felt at many points. That I started off, in Fairbanks, but also going all the way up to Utiavik and other North Slope boroughs, Aquasuk. And then from Fairbanks, we spent time on the Dalton Highway, traveling all the way up to Prudhoe Bay, but also stopping in Tulik Field Station. And then we had a little bit of time left, so we decided let's drive all the way down to Anchorage. We need to get some more data. But the pictures up here, this is an example. This is what the Science Research kind of center or housing for scientists looks like in the far north in Utiavik. Here is a picture of the rear, side view mirror with the big mountains in the background. We spent a lot of time in the truck driving up and down the roads. one of the experiences I didn't know I would have was getting to stay at a trucker camp along the Dalton Highway, which was really interesting. And then we also have the Tulik Field Station up here in Alaska. For the students who are joining us, if you're kind of looking for something to explore next after this webinar, I would recommend spending some time with Google Earth and flying over and kind of hovering on different regions of Alaska and see kind of your observations of how southern Alaska kind of varies from mid-Alaska, and then how things really start to change after you pass the Brooks Range and we get up here into the North Slope, where everything is kind of off the road system and it's all permafrost. You can see a lot of these variations if you just play around a little bit with Google Earth. So that could be something fun to play around with after this webinar. What did we do? So I got to do a polar science sampler, do a lot of different research and a lot of different visits. I'd say the predominant thing I spent my time doing was thaw depth measurements. So I would either alone, or when Christina had finished doing some other work, she'd come and help me. We would measure out 50 to 100 meter transects and then take thaw depth probes. I think we actually have one sitting around. Oh, here it is, my favorite thing. This is a thaw depth probe. They can get pretty big and pretty deep, but we would use these and stick them in along the transect. This is something you can only do in person, and you have to do with human labor. I took over 2,000 thaw depth measurements while I was in Alaska and in the field. We also took a lot of soil samples. Sometimes they were easier to get, sometimes they were harder. You can see here we were traipsing through some of the tundra with snow, even though it was August. I did get to go and visit the Permafrost tunnel and do some visual observations of what permafrost looks like. I did a community visit with Dr. Watts, and we spoke to some Inupiat students in a science classroom. And here you see I've caught my very first lemming. I joined a couple different science teams that were looking at lemming populations in the Arctic. But today we're really going to focus on this picture over here, which is a soil respiration station, which is what the Woods Hole Research Center and the NASA Above project are using to get more information about winter respiration. And we're going to kind of talk about this in more depth. So first of all, the main focus of our webinar today is on permafrost. So what is permafrost? So students out there, you may or may not be familiar with this, but I have a really hard time understanding what permafrost was until I actually got to go and see it, because I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, and there's not any permafrost. Yeah. We actually sent some students out right now just to check, and they can confirm we do not have any permafrost in Boston, Massachusetts. But what permafrost is ground or soil that has been frozen for 2 or more years. It could be frozen for 2 years, 3 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years, and infinite time, but a minimum of 2 years. And when we're looking at Alaska and where we were, you can see we were hanging out in between where there's discontinuous permafrost and continuous permafrost up in the North Slope. And this is kind of what it'll look like underground. Christina, other things to add about kind of basics what permafrost is? So it might be an ice wedge, it might be silts, it might be dirt, it's all frozen.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things that you can find in the permafrost. There can be vegetation, so roots, old plant vegetation, bones, all sorts of things you can find in the permafrost that have been frozen and trapped through time.
I can say I didn't think it sounds very different. So when you send that thaw depth probe down and it hits the permafrost, it's more of a thud, and you can hear it. It sounds different than if you hit a rock. It's more of a clank. And I know this is really obvious, but it's really cold. The permafrost is really cold. If you're digging around it, you're digging near it. I know that means it's frozen, but it really hit me when I was in the field when you're digging up soil or doing different measurements from there. And I can get why it's frozen. It's very cold. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of a map showing you where in the world permafrost is located. And this is kind of a cool map because the center is the north. It's a little bit different view of the world than we normally get. So this is, we were up in here, but we see permafrost is existing all around the high Canadian Arctic, parts of Greenland, over in Russia and Siberia. Any of you guys or your parents who watched the 60-minute special 2 weeks ago or so on Pleistocene Park, that is up in Siberia. Where
it's near Chersky,
okay,
which is a northern Siberian community.
So that would be where there's a lot of permafrost as well.
Yeah, yeah, within the continuous permafrost zone. So yeah, this is a typical. A lot of Arctic research is kind of presented, and if you're going to show maps, kind of the circumpolar region here. So a lot of different research is happening and across these permafrost zones.
Okay, so now we are gonna try out, we need you guys to participate, to change. I'm gonna launch this poll. So I would like to hear from you guys. I want to know, what do you think is the most dangerous thing that permafrost holds? Is it the ancient animal bones, kind of the mammoth tusks and the mammoth bones? Is it carbon? Is it viruses? These are kind of zombie viruses that were once frozen and then get reanimated. Or is it the water? So these are 4 things that permafrost holds. Don't be afraid to guess. We can't tell who you are. We can't tell who's answering what. So definitely don't be shy about giving it a guess. But we want to know, what do you guys think? So permafrost has all this stuff. Yes, it's cold, but what is the most dangerous thing in permafrost, and why does it kind of matter? So get those votes in. Impressed so far. People are doing well. Okay. We are going to end the poll. Let's see. Okay, so here are, I think you guys can see the poll results. You can see we've got 5 votes for carbon and 1 vote for viruses. So we're going to talk a little bit about these. So these are all things that are in permafrost, and they're all dangerous in some way or the other, except for, we're going to say, the animal bones are cool, but they are not dangerous. Is there any scientific reason the animal bones could be dangerous, Christina?
I don't think so, no.
They're really cool.
They're cool to find, and they're interesting things to look at and help understand ancient communities, but they're not really dangerous to us.
But in some ways the water is dangerous, or it's definitely impacting things, or it's causing changes. So the water in the permafrost, as it freezes and thaws, just like we experience in other, with frost heaves, but this is kind of frost heave extremes. So as the permafrost freezes and thaws, it can impact houses, it can impact roads, and this is going to impact human civilization. As the water in the permafrost is freezing and thawing, it will either lead to new lakes and rivers and waterways forming, or former lakes, riverways, and waters disappearing, depending upon where it's at in the cycle. It'll also impact vegetation, either more vegetation and less vegetation, and because of life cycle, this can impact the lemmings, which can then impact the snowy owls, which can then impact other animals on the food chain. So the changes as the permafrost is thawing, the water is definitely impacting things. It can be dangerous for humans, it can be dangerous for some of the animals, but not our most dangerous thing. And no one said water anyways, but we still wanted to show you guys that. Okay, the zombie anthrax, the viruses. Who is afraid of zombie anthrax? I am afraid of zombie anthrax. My family and friends were afraid that when I was going to the permafrost, I was going to, pick up some sort of zombie viruses. This appears to be scary, and it seems like a lot of the things we see on television, and this is indeed an example of some caribou that did pass away as some ancient viruses thawed and kind of came up to the surface and they were exposed to it. So this is dangerous, but it's not happening in high numbers, and it's really, it's very, very rare.
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
Yeah, so far, I'm not super familiar with the viruses that have been released or that potentially could be released, but as so far for the human aspect, it's not super dangerous for humans, but it's definitely impacting some species out there, but it's still really quite rare.
And it's very, very small numbers. It's just one of those things you're more likely to hear about on the news, mm-hmm. because it's, with the popularity of Walking Dead, or, just thinking about zombies or viruses, it's just an easier story to tell, but it's just not happening in those sorts of numbers. But as you guys said, it's really the carbon in the permafrost that is the most interesting for us as researchers and thinking about climate change. And it's something, we don't necessarily immediately think of when we're thinking about the permafrost. but the emissions, the CO2 emissions that are happening, that are stored in the permafrost, are going to be impacting kind of the climate and greenhouse gases and climate loops and things of the sort. And that's really what we're going to be kind of focusing on today. So Christina, teach us.
All right, so I'm going to just get into a little bit more of this technical side of things that we've been, of how we've been measuring changes in permafrost in Alaska as part of our above project. So basically, kind of what we're hoping to understand from our research here is how carbon is changing in the Arctic, and what's the pathway of it, where's it going, what's happening as this permafrost is thawing, and how these ecosystems are changing. So we have this equipment, we call them soil respiration stations, and basically we have these set up across a few different sites in Alaska, and what these are measuring is carbon dioxide flux. So a flux is the rate of release of carbon dioxide from the soil to the atmosphere. So within the soil, there's all these microorganisms, and they are breaking down the carbon and releasing it into the atmosphere as a form of carbon dioxide. So just as we breathe and release carbon dioxide, so do they. Or they're converting it to CO2. So we want to understand how, what the rate of this carbon dioxide release and how much is being released across this region throughout the entire year. It's particularly difficult to measure carbon dioxide flux during the winter, so that's definitely been a focus of this project. So we have these systems that we're hoping to have that to be fully automated and run continuously throughout the year, so you can get an idea of how much carbon is actually being released annually from the Arctic. So that's why we have this carbon dioxide flux. That other picture there, that's actually what our chambers look like. They're called forced diffusion chambers. So those allow us to capture the gas and measure it as it comes out of the soil, so we can get an idea of what that flux measurement is at each of these sites.
Okay. So just to kind of reiterate, so we have permafrost, which is soil and all of its friends that have been frozen for 2 or more years underneath the ground. As it thaws, so as it gets warmer, there is carbon. So just like, like carbon in the plant matter and the organic matter that could be 2 years old or could be 10,000 years old. Depends how old the permafrost is. Yeah. So we have all of this carbon in the permafrost. It's thawing. And so as it thaws, it, there's this whole new source of carbon for these microorganisms to break down. So once you have that permafrost thawing, there's a greater amount of carbon in the soil for these microorganisms to access. So they start breaking that down. So they start eating all of this, it's like a giant meal for all of a sudden. Way more. More food for them. So they're going to start eating it. And then they go through the carbon cycle, which I know you guys learn about in science class, but for me as a history teacher, I don't, so they're going to eat it, and then it comes out as CO2, and CO2 can be a greenhouse gas and climate. Okay. Yeah, so basically, because every year you just have your natural carbon cycle, but now with the flying permafrost, you're just adding to this cycle. So you just have this whole greater pool of carbon that's now being added to this system that wasn't accessible before. And I think, as you kind of said, one of the really cool and interesting things about this particular project is that it's, some scientists have been able to measure this and have been looking at these rates in the summer. I mean, that's easy. That's not hardcore Arctic science. It's still pretty tough, depending on where you are. But what these scientists have been doing is they've been trying to work with these different measuring tools to get a continuous measurement. So you're getting all year round, because there's this question of what's happening up there in the winter. Initially, the assumption was it was not significant. And as we've been able to get tools up there and been able to do this continuous measurement, 363, occasionally it shuts down. Yeah. Yeah, we miss a few days here and there. Occasionally we lose a day, but that kind of including these this continuous and winter things have been an additional piece of data that we haven't necessarily had as a scientific community previously. Yeah. And it's still evolving, but. Yeah, it's definitely still evolving. Yeah, so it definitely is a relatively new thing. We'll have taken just some chamber measurements, just only have one day to kind of estimate the entire winter. So we're hoping to try and shorten that gap and get a few more measurements to help fill in and get a better understanding of what's actually happening during the winter. If there's still, depending on how much carbon is being released during the winter, is that going to change our idea of how much carbon as a whole is being released from the Arctic on an annual basis. Yeah, so you have these soil respiration stations, and there's, it's not just the forced forced diffusion chambers. So like, what else is going on here, and why do you need these measurements? And
yeah, so we also want to understand how other aspects of the ecosystems are changing in response to climate change, and two really important drivers of factors that influence carbon dioxide flux are soil moisture and soil temperature. So it's really important that we have these two environmental measurements going on so we can help understand why the fluxes are what they are, and also to help us predict what might happen in the future. So we have soil temperature measurements happening at all of our sites. So we have our soil probes, which is that top sensor there. And so we dig a hole in the soil and we insert that probe into the ground. And that will continuously measure the temperature of the soil throughout the year. So you can get a long-term record of that. And then we also are measuring soil moisture, which is that other probe at the bottom of the screen there. So we also insert that into the soil, and that measures how wet the soil is. And these two parameters are kind of the main drivers of carbon dioxide flux. So knowing these, we can help understand how the fluxes might change. For instance, if the soils continue to get more warm, if they get wetter, drier, how that's going to impact the flux. So yeah, these relationships are really important to understand in order to be able to scale up for the whole region of Alaska, or to understand how these might change as temperatures in the Arctic change.
So before you ladies go further into this piece, there's a lot of questions related to what you've covered so far. So this might be, rather than letting it get too far along here, because it relates to just even understanding what permafrost is, and then a lot of questions about the CO2. So I'm going to kind of go backwards. Okay, so was it really cold where you did the research? Let's start with that one, a basic one about where you were in Alaska and how cold it was.
So when I was up in Utqiagvik, Barrow, and helping out some researchers, it was early August, mid-August. It was summer, but I would say it was very cold. I developed a dance that I called the Arctic salsa that I would do while I was helping out the researchers. And we also had a couple of Arctic tents that we could go into to warm up with. But then once I started, when we were down around Fairbanks and kind of central Alaska, I would say it was pretty warm. It was summer and pretty casual, like you need a jacket and pants. We weren't in shorts and tank tops, but.
Yeah, depending on where you are in Alaska in the summer, especially around the Fairbanks area, if you're, peak summer, it can get up to probably around like 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I still work in Celsius, so I'm trying to convert.
Christina's Canadian.
I'm Canadian, so I go by Celsius, but so it can get up as warm as like 70, 75 in the summer. But definitely near the end of the summer, it can start to get cold, especially overnight. You can start getting chilly weather even at the end of what we call summer. So into August, we actually had snow when we were up in the high Arctic. So it can be pretty chilly.
So yeah, when we were up in Tulik, we could not fly the helicopter because it was there was snow and it was too cold, and we were taking soil samples in the cold. And in the permafrost tunnel, it was definitely cold.
Okay, great. So related to temperature again, how cold is permafrost? Is it colder than frozen water?
Same temperature.
Yeah. So yeah, it's frozen ground. So yeah, definitely has to be below 0 degrees Celsius because it is frozen. But yeah, the permafrost actually, it has different temperatures. They do have, I'm not exactly sure the exact number of how cold it can actually get. But they do have, there is a network of permafrost temperatures across a few different sites. There's some, they're called boreholes. So you measure a huge hole in the ground, and you have temperature probes down there that will measure the different temperatures of the permafrost at different depths. So usually the deeper you go, the colder it will be in the ground. And that will usually be more stable the deeper you are.
Okay. So a question earlier when I think you showed your when you showed your permafrost thing, scientific equipment, what happened when you hit the permafrost, and did you have to pound it into the ground?
Okay, so with taking those thaw depth measurements with the soil probe, in most of the areas we were at in the tundra, you could, with most of my like bicep strength, I could get it through the soil. Occasionally I had to sit on it or kind of like jump on it to get it through when there was kind of thicker mineral soil or if there were a lot of rocks. But for the most part, I could do it kind of with my human strength, which is not very strong. And then you could just kind of hear it, and then I would know where the permafrost was, and that would give me the thaw depth measurement, and I could just kind of pull it out.
Yes, you don't have to go any deeper than that.
But if you wanted to get a ice core sample, that's when you would bring out those big drills.
Yeah, we have a special type of drill to actually take permafrost samples. So it has really sharp teeth on the bottom, and so you actually have a power, like a motor, that will cut into the permafrost and cut that ice out.
I was just, for the thought up, we just wanted to hit the permafrost and know that, like, once you hit that ding, that was deep enough. We didn't have to go any further.
Okay.
Thankfully.
Yeah, exactly. So with your map about where permafrost is, we are wondering why only the edges around Greenland have permafrost.
I was wondering that too, Christina. Do you, like, when I saw that map,
I'm not 100% sure why that is. I don't know if it might have something to do with just being able to access it, because it is covered in an ice sheet. So
I think this is my educated guess, is that Christina, you just hit the responded to it. It's because the rest of it is an ice sheet. So that's the exposed land, and so probably the only parts that you can actually measure permafrost, and the rest is under an ice sheet.
That's what I think. Yeah, so we don't actually know because it's we can't tell.
But it's definitely not because it's too warm.
Yeah, so there's probably permafrost there, but we can't confirm or deny whether there's permafrost.
Right. Yeah, it's probably just a definition of what is permafrost versus an ice sheet.
Yeah.
And then related to that map, why is permafrost so close to the ocean? Like, why do you find it along the ocean versus just not all the way inland?
So, I mean, it would be it wouldn't be along any ocean. I think that's the one thing, is we're not going to see that same sort of pattern where we see permafrost in other areas of the world. Like in Hawaii, it's on the tops of mountains. It's on the tops of volcanoes. So it's it's definitely not, in other areas of the world, the ocean it's not like necessarily causal. Like the ocean isn't causing it. It's just that with the Arctic Ocean, it's so cold that it's not impacting it or causing the permafrost around the edge to melt. Is that, or thaw?
Yeah, like you definitely have like coastal permafrost. So yeah, there is like right at the border of the ocean, but doesn't really have anything to do with the ocean. It's just more of like that latitudinal gradient of temperature. So just like because the area around the Arctic Ocean is so cold, that's why you have permafrost around that whole region.
So it's because it's so far north, and the Arctic Ocean is just such a unique, or the Arctic is unique in that it's land, it's water, not land, versus the South Pole, which is land. You know, the Arctic or the Antarctic is the sheet.
Yes, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, that answers it.
Yeah. Sorry. Man, wow.
You got some tough questions here. This is what you're thinking. Is the air pressure different in Alaska?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know anything.
So depending on like what elevation you're at and where you are, the air pressure is going to vary.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, and now we'll get to some CO2 questions, and then I'll let you go back to what your presentation was. So, lots of CO2 questions. Let's see. If CO2 is growing, is photosynthesis? Oh, now I gotta find it. Hold on. I lost the question. And Judy, pipe in if you see it before I do about the photo. Oh yeah, if CO2 is going up, is the photosynthesis going up too?
So yeah, it actually, in the whole Arctic region, it depends. So with warming temperatures, it's depending if you have increased CO2, that might actually help plants a little bit more, because they do need that carbon dioxide. But yeah, it kind of depends on where you are and what's happening on kind of like a larger ecosystem level, I would say. I'm not 100% sure if there's like yes or no or to that, but in some regions of the Arctic, we have been seeing increased plant activity, and then in other regions, so there's kind of like a greening effect, so there's more plant activity, more photosynthesis, and then other areas of the Arctic, you're actually having a browning effect where that vegetation is actually becoming less productive and actually dying, and the communities are changing. So as far as like more CO2, I think it depends on where you are and what the other environmental factors are. So yeah, that's a tough one to answer.
I think that's why
it needs a little, yeah,
there's more research,
out of my depth, yeah.
But that's that things are, the causations in the Arctic are very complicated.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I really started to learn and see, that it's not just a matter of understanding one element. That it all is very dependent on that geographic location and a lot of different things that are going on. So it's not just a matter of measuring the carbon flux. Again, we have to measure all these other things to try and get clues as to what's really going on. And this question of kind of what's going on in the Arctic as a whole can be very complicated, and scientists disagree because there's so many different measurements and things that we're finding out, that a lot of the data just leads to more questions.
Yeah.
So this will be so I guess kind of related to that, and this will be my last one so you can keep going, but are any of the organisms, the photosynthetic organisms, taking up some of that CO2?
Yeah, there's definitely photosynthetic organisms active. They would definitely be uptaking that CO2. So yeah, just what in charge of, just like thinking of the whole carbon dioxide release throughout the whole season or throughout the whole year, depending on what the vegetation is doing. If you actually have more productive vegetation, you have greater uptake of CO2 during the summer, during that growing season. And then potentially during the winter, when those plants aren't being active, you could also have more respiration happening, or they're both increasing at the same time, but which one is increasing more at a greater rate? We actually have some other scientists at the Woods Hole Research Center actually looking into this question and trying to figure out, is there more uptake happening now as temperatures are increasing, or is there more release happening, and just how this carbon balance is gonna shape up as the climate changes.
Yeah, and for our audience, there's a number of journals and teachers that have worked with the Woods Hole scientists that you can read more about that whole carbon balance. And there's even, for the educators online, there's also some resources that teachers have designed, lessons plans centered around that. So you can look on the PolarTREC website to look at all that. Yeah. All right, I will let you two continue here. There's some other related questions, but we'll get to those at the end here.
Okay.
Talk a little bit about fire.
Yeah, so another big thing, so yeah, there's this whole huge puzzle of trying to figure out what's happening in the Arctic and what this means for the permafrost regions and the carbon balance. So another impact of climate change in the Arctic is fire. So it has been predicted that as the climate continues to warm, fires will become more frequent. So we do have a few sites. Part of our project is looking at the impact of fire on these permafrost zones. So this is just two examples of our sites. We have in the Boreal region, they're called Hess Creek. So we have one that unburned on the left side there, a nice boreal forest, black spruce trees, and then the burn site, I can't remember exactly when this fire happened. I think it was over 10 years ago. But as you can see, it definitely takes a long time for these forests to regenerate after a fire was pretty severe. But we're looking at the impact of this fire on these sites, so how this impacts the permafrost, how it impacts the soil temperature, the soil moisture, and as a result, how is that impacting the carbon flux? Is there more carbon dioxide being released from this burn site? Is that impacting that way? Is there less? How is this changing? And if there are going to be more fires, what does this mean for a long-term global carbon balance?
And these fires are kind of naturally occurring. Most of them are from lightning strikes or kind of storms. These are not human or directly human set fires.
Yeah, so for the most part, yeah, lightning strikes are the most common fire starter in Alaska and tundra fires. So yeah, with climate change, there's more storms or more severe storms, so more lightning strikes, and so as a result, more forest fires or tundra fires. So another part of this project, this is a lot of the work that Jennifer Watts has been doing. So this kind of maps, we have the whole Alaska region as well as a good portion of the Canadian high Arctic moving into the Yukon and Northwest Territories. So it's kind of the whole NASA above domain. So we just have our few sites across Alaska, but using the information from these sites as well as from different research projects from other scientists who've been doing work across the Canadian Arctic and Alaska is to actually try and scale our carbon dioxide measurements for the entire region to understand what's happening for this particular above region, then also try and scale it for the entire Pan-Arctic region. So it's a big to try and understand what's happening on the whole global scale. It's a lot of work, and it takes, it's crazy to think that we're basing these estimations off just a few measurements, but it's the best we have. So what just some of these maps are showing, just to give you a little bit of idea, the lighter colors like the yellow and greens means that there's more carbon, and the blue is less carbon release. So this is just an example of how the rates of carbon are changing for this region across kind of the winter season months. So going from September, kind of transitioning into winter, October, and so you can see in January, there's more blue, so there's a lower carbon flux, but this map, what this map is showing is that there's still carbon being released from this Arctic region during the winter. So yeah, just kind of a touching base. This is kind of what the different communities look like. So tundra and wetland in that red, and then the boreal forest and wetlands in that green. So eventually scaling up just from that above region and working with other scientists and other collaborations is to understand what's happening across this whole Pan-Arctic region, to understand how carbon cycling is changing in boreal and tundra regions across the globe.
So what in the world is a world history teacher going to do with all this information about permafrost? There were some ways I kind of expected it to impact my classroom and some ways I didn't expect. So one thing I did not expect and kind of was really surprised by is this kind of larger NASA Above project that is bringing together data from all different levels, that they are taking kind of data on the ground. They're also taking data from planes, and then they're taking data from satellite imagery and combining it all together to get a bigger picture of the Arctic. And that was something I just didn't really know about and understand. And one unexpected way that's impacted my classroom is we've started to do a little bit of work with drones and using drones to collect data, and also just using, you see here a student using Google Earth Pro to use some satellite imagery to do some mapping, to start thinking about what data can we see from space, just about kind of any topic, not necessarily Arctic or permafrost, but that this is a whole set of data that we can use in the history classroom, in the science classroom, that is something I didn't know a lot about. Another thing I've had a lot of fun using with my classes, and all these resources are linked through the PolarTREC lesson availability, but I have made some Google 360-degree fully immersive Google Poly tours of the NASA Above sites to kind of show how these soil respiration stations are working. You can kind of go and get a 360 view of the difference between a burned and unburned site. Here you see students exploring and turning around, looking at these different sites. I also have, as best quality as I could get, a video of the permafrost tunnel, so you can kind of walk through and see the permafrost tunnel, see some of what it looks like, and some of the ice wedges that you can get through the PolarTREC website. So I've been kind of working on sharing, how can we bring the Arctic to our students using 360 and immersive storytelling, so that people can learn more about what Arctic science is, what polar science is happening, and then what it feels like to be up there. Here are some of my students just kind of getting a sense of what the gear is like. And then I did my first scientific conference, which was a whole new adventure, to kind of share with start continuing to converse with the scientific community. Christina actually visited my classroom today, so this is work that this is her third class today. She's getting to feel like what it's like to be a teacher, but we're really kind of just experimenting with including this permafrost discussion in the history classroom, and it's helping us ask some questions about kind of medieval or pre-modern civilizations, but also civilizations today, getting a better understanding of climate change and thinking more about what's happening with civilizations today. Are they collapsing? Are they changing? What is going to be the impact on Indigenous communities? What is going to be the impact of us in Boston? What is going to be the impact in Canada? You know, all around the world, seeing this better, drawing out these interconnections. And I'd have to say, for the most part, my students had not studied the Arctic before I did this experience. And so just bringing in this whole new region for them to understand has been really exciting and important. So yeah, let's go back to some questions.
Yeah, so we do have a bunch. Maggie and the students from Oregon are taking off, but we'll, they had a bunch more questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, so we have a question that came earlier was how heterogeneous is the permafrost depth in a given area?
Oh, that is a good question. So it is pretty, depending on how you're measuring the permafrost depth. At our sites, we usually set up 3 different transects, usually at least 10 to 15 meters apart. And we measure thaw depth along these transects to kind of get an idea of what the permafrost depth is like at that site. It can be pretty variable. At least at kind of one site, just measuring at those 3 transects, I'd say kind of like plus or minus 10 meters or so, maybe 5, depending on the site. But you could also have an area where there might be a huge ice feature, so that might thaw really fast or collapse during the summer or something. So you might have permafrost really close to the surface and then hit a water feature or something, or an ice wedge, and then that's your thaw depth there might be really deep. So it can be quite variable depending on where you are, but also very consistent at the same time. So yeah, it's quite depending on what your vegetation is like, above ground water, the groundwater system, it can be quite variable as well. So yeah, it depends on what your surface conditions are like.
Yeah, I'd say it's very variably consistent and variable.
Yeah.
So unfortunately that's not, and that's why you really just have to go out there and take all of the measurements, and you have to take them by hand, like human power only, because there's just so many different, and that's why you also need all of the other data, because there's so many factors which are going to impact how big that active layer is. Mm-hmm. So it's really complicated. So we need all these scientists up there doing a lot of work and continuing to investigate.
Okay, so let's see, there was a complicated question earlier. It says, what are the typical rates of new soil organic matter production each growing season, and GCM-2 year 1 or per year, ? And is that changing under the conditions of the warmer summers, changing due to CO2 enriched ATM, ?
So wait, so just, I was like, the question. So
changing rates of organic layer.
Yeah, let's go for the first one. What are the typical rates of new soil organic matter production each growing season? And they basically want to know that rate and how you met, what that, how the rate is measured.
So we're not actually measuring the rate of that generation of organic layer. So I wouldn't have a number that I can actually give you or have an idea of what that generation is every year. It's going to depend on the site. For our sites, we do measure what the organic layer depth is, but we've just done that once for each site just to get an idea of what it is. But I don't think I can answer that question for you. I wouldn't know the answer to it. I'm sorry.
Okay. And then we'll see if they want to clarify that in a moment. Are the probes and all the equipment waterproof, or do you just leave them?
For the most part, they are. Like the sensors themselves are totally fine to be submersed in water if they get wet, rain or snow. The electronics, all of like the wires, the batteries, those are all put in like weatherproof enclosures. But sometimes things leak and equipment gets damaged, or that happens, but we do leave them out year round, and the chambers are fine to just, they have like a water resistant barrier, so gas exchange can happen, but water will not flow through the membrane. It's all made of plastic, so water can't penetrate the chamber. But yeah, for the most part, the equipment is kind of weatherproofed, and we usually protect it. Maybe do a little bit of extra securing before the winter season and check on it at least once a year.
But some of the sites that have been visited more as the permafrost has been disturbed and they're starting to kind of flood. And one of the sites in particular when we visited was very, very, very wet.
Yeah.
And it was kind of starting to get to the point of, it wasn't, the water was getting too deep for how the site, or for how the equipment's set up, that the batteries were going to drown.
Yeah, so yeah, you definitely don't want your equipment to be swimming in a puddle or something. But yeah, for the most part, it is weatherproof.
But most of the sites were still kind of holding up, and they were going to make it year round.
Okay. And then while we see if anybody else has additional questions, there was from Maggie's school, were there lots of mosquitoes?
Yes.
Well,
it depends on the time of year. I've been there. It depends on where you are and what time of year you're there. So yeah, I've been doing field work there for the last couple of years. Some seasons have been better than others. Especially if you're in the forest and it's kind of a boggy forest, that's a really great place to find mosquitoes. You could definitely need to be wearing your bug shirts and have bug protection. But then if it's windy and you're out in the tundra and it's a little bit more chilly, you won't really have a problem with them.
So I'd say I was there mid-August to mid-September, and I did not need to use any of the bug gear. Occasionally killed a couple mosquitoes, but we had amazing weather and amazing bug levels.
No, I guess how lucky you were. Geez, but you did say it snowed. You did say it snowed too, so there you go. All right, well, anybody else have extra questions? Let's see. Yep, here comes one. Kim, can you explain a little more on how you are connecting this experience to the world history classroom regarding ancient and current day civilizations? Are there any lessons to share? Great question.
Yeah, so I think what I'm just starting, the lessons we have that are ready right now are more connected to the polar science and how these kind of soil respiration stations are working, and the 360 permafrost tunnel tour, and then kind of the ESRI story map, which takes, Christine and I co-designed, kind of taking students to the Hess Creek burn and unburned site, doing some field observations, looking at thaw depth and soil temperature measurements to kind of make a larger connection, and that is up and available. But the stuff that I'm working on and now with that is then how it gets integrated into world history. And that's what we're doing with students now. And then after I kind of have a chance to test it with them, it will go up on the PolarTREC website. But the connections I saw and would like to build more is just once students have a better background knowledge about permafrost and about climate change, looking more specifically at how it's impacting modern day Arctic communities, and perhaps have students understand the challenges they're facing. We do study medieval and pre-modern civilizations of the Americas. So while students are looking at the Iroquois, Anasazi, Inuit, Aztec, Maya, and Inca civilizations, and one big theme we're looking at through all these civilizations is how they collapsed and if they collapsed and what some of the factors were. So students were just looking at the Anasazi and looking at why they collapsed and some of the environmental factors that led to that in terms of deforestation and drought. And then looking and making some connections with that in the Inuit communities, or kind of just high Arctic communities of Alaska and Canada. In the North Slope, it's Inupiat communities, but just kind of looking at, I want to develop more looking into how those communities are being impacted by the permafrost thaw, and have my students thinking about what are the severity of these changes and how that may impact those peoples, and then how that, ultimately, what sorts of changes might we see in other parts of the world, in our area, kind of Boston, are we going to see also due to climate change, permafrost being a part of that? How may our ways of life change, and will that, how much will that change that? Is that a kind of just how a society grows and change, or will that lead to our society or civilization becoming totally new and different? Are we going to have to move? Are we not going to have to move? I'm interested in those questions and kind of seeing what students are thinking about in that. And so more kind of curriculum and lesson plans to come. But so far I see a lot of connections in these big questions about kind of society's collapses and changes, and seeing, including climate change as one of those topics of discussion, which we previously just haven't discussed.
Okay, this is Judy. Are there any other questions that someone might have? Thank you for that detailed answer. That was great.
Yeah, it was very good.
So more to come. Keep following my PolarTREC journals, and all the stuff on stuff will kind of keep coming up over the next couple months, and then over the coming years as I keep revising, but more world history permafrost lessons to come.
Very good. Before everybody kind of goes away, I'm going to launch a poll about our event. And in the meantime, I also want to thank our team for sharing their experience with us. It was great. And I hope other people will join this summer. There's a lot of educators that are also going out into the field and joining or covering permafrost and similar topics. So it will be really nice to kind of follow up on what you two presented today.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you guys for putting this together.
Yeah.
And a huge thank you to everyone attending from all sorts of different places, students and everyone else, all these amazing questions. You stumped us.
Yeah, great questions. Some things to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll have you stop sharing there, Kim. Okay. Just go to while we wait. Yeah, so if anybody else has questions, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll share this archive with everybody online. And Christina, how much longer are you going to be there?